You're listening to Jay's Analysis, integrating film, philosophy, geopolitics, literature, history, economics, intrigue, and espionage, only at jaysanalysis.com. And now, Jay's Analysis Podcast, with your host, Jay Dyer.
One of the most controversial and seemingly fringe topics out there is the subject of underground bases. Most of the time, this topic is muddled with all sorts of alien jibber-jabber and speculations that really have no grounding in reality. But there is something to the underground base phenomena. They exist all over the U.S. and presumably throughout the world. In this talk, Sofia and I cover what we think might be going on, and we try to ground our speculations in the evidence that we could come across that seems legitimate. So we don't fly off into aliens and so forth, but we do try to stay somewhat grounded. In this talk, you will hear her give her thesis, much of which I think is very insightful, and I'm going to also recommend that you check out her work at aboutthesky.com. And you can find her products there as well. She has a store where she sells various products for healthy living. And also check out my site, jaysanalysis.com, where you can subscribe for the full interview with Sofia and myself.
You're listening to Jay's Analysis. This time I have a special guest, Sofia Smallstorm, somebody who I've learned a lot from over the last couple of years, watching a lot of her videos, listening to her podcasts, and reading her site. And I think that what stands out about Sofia's work is that it's very large scale. It's a meta-analysis. It's a big picture look, critical thinking applied to making connections between a lot of seemingly disparate fields. And that's something that I try to do in my analysis. And so I think that given how much I've learned from her, I'd like to have her on to get some insights and wisdom from her. So, Sofia, how are you today?
I'm just fine, Jay. I'm very honored to be doing a show with you because I have heard of you and listened to some of your interviews. I need to plumb your work much more, but we didn't cross paths until very recently. So it's very wonderful for me to meet you. Thank you.
Absolutely. The first thing that stands out to me that I took away from when I first started looking at your work was, of course, things relating to geoengineering and Sandy Hook and the way that you tried to do a 3, 4, 5D analysis of Sandy Hook, which that really, nobody does that. Everybody always talks about, this fact, this piece of evidence versus that fact, and is it real or is it not? And I like that you laid out that we are given our reality from 2D screens, right? 2D screens produce the overlay by which we're supposed to interpret our 3D reality. I thought that was a brilliant insight, and I think that this is applicable here because you are pulling from different areas, and you're saying, okay, well, is there perhaps a connection between what we see with the history of the Manhattan Project and, say, the Atomic Energy Commission and these different underground projects? Might that have some connection to these other projects that deal with geoengineering, synthetic life, synthetic biology? And I think that they do, and I think you're correct to make that analysis. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about, you mentioned in your newest newsletter, how this kind of begins with radiation and something that seems on the surface that would seem toxic and not so that we don't want 3 eyes and 4 arms, right? Doesn't that? But actually, if you think about it, developing 3 eyes or 4 arms or whatever, 16 toes on your head, that actually would relate to genetic modification. So maybe you could tell us about how radiation is relevant to going down this rabbit hole of the deep underground bases.
Well, you've asked me to make an extremely broad connection.
Well, you're good at that.
Well, I mean, you're throwing me like a curveball, but I will try. So You can go into the history of radiation yourself. There are different levels of, uh, let's say, effect on biological tissues.
Hmm.
Radiation. Radiation is really sort of, as far as I understand it, um, everything is a wave. And we have light waves, we have sound waves, we have radio frequency waves that our ears can't hear, that carry sound and data that our eyes can't see. And so this wave spectrum is immense, but biological forms can only really acclimate to a very small portion of it. And there are agitations caused to biology by different parts of the wave spectrum. And when you talk about ionizing and non ionizing radiation, thermal and non-thermal, those are the same names for those uh, two things. They cause jolting to cells and they cause damage to cells.
Hmm.
And cells, as they become damaged, will attempt to uh, deal with the force that they're feeling and they will mutate, they will change. You will break the DNA in the cell and the cell will try to repair the DNA. And cells can only repair broken DNA like 2 or 3 times. That's it. And then the DNA strands can graft back together and they will graft with errors, and errors are mutations, and mutations are the beginning of biological differences,
Right.
right? And in some ways, mutation is an adaptation response
Hmm.
because the biology is going, all right, well, what do I need to do? Maybe I need to change. Maybe I need to be different in some way to be able to handle this. So the gross deformities that you're talking about, that you see, for instance, from the effects of depleted uranium, where it has been used in warfare, these gross deformities are, you could call them accidental. I believe personally that all of humanity is part of a giant observation program.
Yes, a great experiment. That's what I've talked about as well. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, the ubiquitousness, the presence, the prevalence of many forms of radiation in our lives today doesn't look like it's going away. We have a debate about whether we should use nuclear power or not. And we've got old leaky reactors hanging out on the Earth's surface, in different parts of the country that are causing an outcry by activists. And most normal people don't even care that San Onofre radiation plant, or Indian Point nuclear plant, rather. Why am I calling them radiation plants? But they're giving off radiation to the surrounding communities. Most people, they don't even care because they're not educated, they're not aware, and we're pretty much all expecting to end up with cancer. It's so much part of the conversation today in terms of health. But I believe that we're also bathed in wireless radiation, which is
Yes.
becoming more prevalent than it ever, ever, ever was. So we're living in an environment that is full of potential for biological damage. And everyone asks, well, the elites, the people who are doing this, it's going to happen to them too, isn't it? And I used to say, yes, it is, and they don't mind because they evidently want to be integrated with some artificial life.
Yes, this was a great point that you brought out. I think in one of your talks where you were dealing with that objection that, well, how would this work if they're all going to be blasted with the same radiation? I think you were making the point that that's precisely the point, right? In other words, there needs to be a generation or two that are blasted with this kind of toxic frequency to kind of what I've talked about often force what it force evolution to occur in their perspective. So in other words, if you can force the adaptation, test what happens, look and try to analyze what happens, then you can perhaps make a technology out of the adaptation so that you in other words so that you know the pattern of how to adapt in the future. So in other words, if our generation or the next generation or two or three are subjected to this, then you watch the way that the body reacts in order to create the technology by which you can no longer be damaged by all of these frequencies, because for the nanotech to work, you need to be able to receive, right, all of these frequencies without getting cancer that leads to death, right?
Right. And what I'd like to point out here is piezoelectricity.
Hmm.
I learned this purely by accident from a guy who was very well educated in electrical engineering many years ago. He called it the piezoelectric effect. But the body uses crystals and it has its own capacity to generate and utilize voltage. And the piezoelectric effect is a reciprocal phenomenon in that when you apply voltage to a crystal, um, it yields a frequency. And when you apply a frequency to a crystal, it results in producing voltage or current. So many materials in the body experience and utilize piezoelectricity. This is wireless energy,
Right.
wireless electricity, and it involves the presence of crystalline forms. And when we study nanotech embedding in the body, whether, by consent or not, the Morgellons people are making huge numbers of crystals in their bodies. There is a definite effort to integrate and place within human tissue and human cellular structures these crystalline materials that are artificial. And people are actually exuding them. I received pictures today from somebody of a whole new bunch of crystals and quartzes with nano dots on them that come directly out of nanotechnology industry. So why are people's bodies making these things? And you suggested that they're observing the way the body responds so they can tweak and alter the technology. But the fact is they're embedding the technology into people's tissues and flesh. And they're integrating crystalline materials to enlarge the scope of piezoelectricity within biological forms, which makes them more frequency responsive.
Right.
That's why we live in a world of so many frequencies now, getting worse and worse.
Yeah, and so the point is to create a synthetic overlay. In other words, to basically, this entire world is intended to be a cocoon, which is what you kind of talked about recently in some interviews, so that we can hatch the, I guess, hybrid forms or the synthetic forms. Now that sounds crazy, but the problem is, or the thing about things that sound crazy is that, for example, if you read Huxley's Brave New World, he says in the book that the entire world of Brave New World is a giant test lab. It's a giant scientific test tube. It's a lab where every different section of the globe that's underneath these 10 socialist world dictators, they're basically a big lab experiment. And on top of that, Mustafa Mond in the book, there's a reason I'm saying this. It's relevant to the conversation. Mustafa Mond says, we actually give everyone a false science. We give them this dumbed down pseudoscience. He says, and actually there's a deeper metaphysical science that's at work that we work on in secret. And so I've talked a lot about hidden metaphysics, or there's a kind of I guess just basically the idea of suppressed science, which is somewhat speculative, but there's a basis for thinking this. Now, can I get really weird with you, Sophia?
Yeah.
I grew up in the 80s. I was a kid of the 80s, and I grew up watching the cartoon show G.I. Joe, as I'm sure most boys of my age did. And I remember there was always these really weird throw-ins to G.I. Joe episodes, and I didn't know why, of course, until now as I'm much older, and I understand how the Pentagon works with TV shows and movies and cartoons and so forth to craft propaganda. There was actually a G.I. Joe episode back in the 80s that dealt with piezoelectric crystals. Can you believe that?
Do you remember what it was about?
Yeah, they've discovered the ability of the crystals to. I'm looking at a description of the episode, and it made me think about. But when you were talking about it, it made me think about this. But It gets into what you're talking about, that the Joe team and Cobra team, they discover the latent potentialities within these crystals, right? And so it ends up being this kind of, they uh, make it into a super weapon, more or less. And that, it's not directly dealing with transhumanism, although many of the GI Joe episodes do, because I'm a weirdo. So I actually went back and watched all two or three seasons of the '80s GI Joe episodes, and I'm not kidding you. They deal with pretty much all the stuff you talk about. so so Cobra actually creates synthoids, or they create these synthetic versions of humans to replace actual humans, and they're basically run by wireless technology. Cobra also is engaged in weather modification and geoengineering, mind control, MK Ultra. All these things are literally mentioned in the show, and you wonder why that would be. Well, I actually went and did some research on the people that put together this show, and there are two or three guys. One of them's name is Friedman, off the top of my head, but he actually works with Princeton and the Pentagon, and so it's a direct link to, I believe it was Princeton University, a direct link to propaganda in, children's cartoon shows. And this professor dealt with social engineering and psychology and sociology and so forth. But I mean, that's what I deal with a lot, is the relationship between, movies and cartoons and television and truth. But I try to do it in a, somewhat academic way, so it's not just speculation. And you find these connections all the time, that the system is, uh, it's, since it's full spectrum dominance, it's concerned with all areas of life. And anyway, I'm rambling, but the point is that you just made me think of this GI Joe episode when you're talking about piezoelectric crystals, and basically the idea of hidden technology, suppressed technology behind, this idea, because our cells are kind of little tuning forks, to little antennas that pick up these frequencies, and we are being bathed in this, as you say.
Right, and that was for children. Can you believe that? And when if you study, the subconscious, throw that into the mix, then these children are getting very potent education that they're absorbing without understanding it. I mean, but really, if that's what those GI Joe shows were about, it's amazing to
It
me.
is. I've not seen. I mean, I studied this. I did my master's work on the subject of propaganda in fiction, and I've not found any show that had as much crazy stuff in it as the '80s GI Joe cartoon. Believe it or not. Now, I mean, I focused on other things like Ian Fleming and Bond and things like that, but when it comes to just wild, out there, transhumanist, mind control type stuff, geoengineering, HARP, that's all in GI Joe, of all things. And the only thing that I could, I mean, there's a lot of different theories on, revelation of the method and psychological warfare in relation to what is predictive programming, why is it there, it's conditioning, et cetera, et cetera. But I still don't have my finger on why GI Joe would have so much of it. I mean, obviously, I think GI Joe is intended to influence young boys to kind of go through this warrior programming, that, oh, I'm going to go fight for Joe, which is America, right? So
Mhm.
it's a recruitment. It's an early version of recruitment propaganda. But as to why it would have so much of this, things that are only now coming to light, I don't really know. But
Well,
anyway,
again, it's tutoring on an unconscious
there
level.
you go. There you
The
go.
generation that will be hopefully enlisting and serving. I mean, the military is at the center of a lot of this
Oh yeah.
stuff,
Oh yeah.
you
Yeah,
know?
especially the Navy. Yeah.
Well, exactly. And I did a newsletter recently on dolphins. I've read two books on whales and dolphins in the recent months, and I am stunned at how much the Navy jumps
Yes.
in every time. John Lilly, for instance, was a scientist of a sort who was
Yes, and he was part
studying
of MK Ultra. Yes.
the consciousness of dolphins, the metaphysical qualities of dolphin consciousness. And the Navy was right there funding him.
Yeah. They tried dolphin assassins. They tried all kinds of crazy stuff. Absolutely.
Yeah, but they have their finger in every pie. They're actually making the pies.
Exactly.
So, we can't be surprised that G.I. Joe would be full of this more than any other show because this is the basic brain in the center of uh, this whirlpool of testing experimentation, which slowly creeps, I don't know how fast, but I'm just saying slowly creeps into modifying forever the world.
Yes,
And
exactly.
and irretrievably. I mean, you're not going to get nature back. Right now, I put a post on my blog yesterday about gene driving, and the which is a part of GMO experimentation. They now have a technology, a tool. It's an editing tool of sorts called CRISPR, CRISPR, and
Hmm.
it actually embeds, it recodes DNA such that if you alter just a few individuals in a wild species and you stick those individuals out there to mate and breed with the wild population, you will forever alter all members of the wild population. This is what they haven't been able to achieve because when they tinker with genes and put them in wild populations, generally nature selects them out because nature drives out the tinkered genetics because
Yes.
nature is able to determine, just even from the statistics of survivability of these altered organisms, they don't have the same survivability rate. But now they've reversed that with this new tool called CRISPR, and they are looking to drive these gene changes into in every member of a wild population so they can eradicate entire species. And this is new. This is a new frontier.
So quite different from the version of environmentalism that we're given in the mainstream, that they're all concerned with preserving and conserving, and actually it's the island of Dr. Moreau. I did a lengthy analysis of that book, and it's pretty amazing that back in 1895 or four, somewhere in there, H.G. Wells projected this very topic. He said through fiction, he said they will actually blend species and they will create these hybrids and GMO. And actually, at the beginning of the version of the novel that I have, there is a modern geneticist who wrote an essay introducing the book, and she said it's unreal the foresight that Wells had in terms of understanding the plasticity, she says, of the human brain and of the human body. And so, if you take the perspective of plasticity, then the mad scientist really has a formless sort of matter to work with here, right? To try to or to actually move it into any direction that you want to go, and that's ultimately alchemy. So I deal a lot with these kind of esoteric concepts, and we think that alchemy is this Renaissance or medieval discarded notion of superstition, but actually that is, I think, the governing principle at work here. Because the great work, so-called, of the alchemists is to perfect the unperfected, imperfect creation, and that's exactly what you're talking about. You're talking about, oh, we need to get away from the existing nature and move into something perfect, something that um, doesn't die, that continues in permanence, and the only way to do that is through tech.
Right. We will determine what we want to play with next. And if our toy fails, we're going to make a better toy that doesn't fail and that takes over what is natural. And that to me is the real battle. It's artifice and nature. And
Mm-hmm.
one is in some ways much more powerful than the other because of its sheer variation and the sheer unpredictability of it. I knew a psychologist many, many years ago who taught me that the best friendships and relationships are the unpredictable ones, in that you don't know how the person is going to respond, and that person will continually surprise you with new, strengths, and your bond gets stronger, and your bond is constantly renewed in this way. And the worst relationships are the predictable ones. where you always know what the other person is going to do and it's never going to be good.
Hmm.
So what they're trying to do is, I'm making an analogy here. They're trying to take the unpredictability, the, wondrousness of natural variability and capsize it into this very predictable, linear uh, feel that's
Uniformity and monotony. Yeah.
circumscribed, yeah, and very limited and licensed also. So we're looking at a future that's going to be increasingly paid for by us to have anything. Trees in our yard, we'll have to license them from Monsanto. How many? We have 12 varieties of trees that are available in your part of the world. So you pick two, you can have two. And if you want a third one, it's this much more and you have to pay yearly. But that's only the temporary phase. I think they're going to enjoy profits in and during those phases. And then they're going to get to a point where they'll all go underground because what's up here is just not going to be able to make it.
Yes, it reminds me of the film that one of the first films I did a lengthy analysis of was Ridley Scott's Blade Runner. And in Blade Runner, you'll recall that the uh, Tyrell Corporation pretty much dominates that whole world of Blade Runner in LA in the dystopic future. And they create these replicants, and the replicants are indistinguishable from your average human person. And the only way to tell, but they've done this for everything, right? There's replicant snakes, and there's all sorts of different varieties of replicants. And the only way to tell is there's a tiny, tiny logo, a serial number that's printed on various replicant objects or persons or whatever you want to call them, things. And that makes me think of what you're talking about because you're mentioning that they're serialized. And this is apparently what we see from. I watched a video on one of the large genetic companies talking about some of their latest developments, and that's what they were saying. They were saying, "Oh yeah, ha ha ha." There's kind of a joke when you get down to the microscopic level, you can actually see our logo and insignia on the. I think it was about 3D printing, like the arteries and human um, organ printing and so forth. And they were saying, yeah, we're actually you're marked with our company or whatever. If I recall what I was looking, that was a year or so ago. But that ties into exactly to what you're saying because you were posing the thesis, which kind of also reminds me of Invasion of the Body Snatchers. And I noticed you did have an article on that where you talked about how whatever that we're seeing with Morgellons, which there have actually been several mainstream news articles about Morgellons for skeptics out there. Whatever we're seeing about with what this is, what it is, this is loosely pretty close to what's in Invasion of the Body Snatchers because you have this sort of fungus that grows and it then creates the cocoon. The body becomes a cocoon for this other person,
Right. The body,
synthoid or whatever.
yeah, the body begins to be taken over and technologies are, I mean, the body itself becomes in a way a 3D printer
Yes.
that's spewing out things with logos on them.
Hmm.
Really, that's come out of Morgellons people. These little bits, little quartz pieces, circuit boards, all kinds of things that look like they're batteries that are piezo responsive. And many, or let's just say some of these objects that are small in size, they need to have a microscope on them to really determine what they are and what's inscribed in them, which is very, very minuscule. But they're logos and letters and things like that. So, anyway, there are certain people being used to generate materials of many, many kinds. I know of one person whose body is extruding grasshopper type things with eyes that jump across the room and twigs and bark and leaves and I mean lots of different things from the clearly that belong in the biological world that humans should not be able to um, produce in some cavity in their bodies.
Now,
And it doesn't get in there by, just the wind blew and a twig blew into my giant Morgellons lesion deep down and got stuck.
if that sounds strange or far-fetched, you can find mainstream treatments of the kind of diseases where, for example, people's skin turns to bark, or people develop scales. Now, so what I'm saying is that if that's real, then it's not too far-fetched to think that whatever the genetic mutation is in the virus, or if viruses are real, or the bacteria, whatever it is that causes that's happening at the DNA level, if you could tweak that, then conceivably you could cause synthetic life forms. Because, like you point out with dying objects, right? Like when something is decaying or decomposing, that is giving birth to new life forms. And
Yeah,
so by extension,
the trophic chain.
yes, yes.
Yeah. But in the body, I believe there's an artificial intelligence in Morgellons people that's operating independently of them and somehow is using them parasitically um, to harness their, I don't know, to harness them as hosts to the production of um, extra species materials.
Hmm.
And they're able to do this, and the few people that I know who have this capability, I'm learning now, actually had opportunities uh, during which something could have been implanted in them. Visits to naval dispensaries
Hmm.
on a regular basis that, were out of their control, surgeries and whatnot, and strange incisions made in places where the surgery was not supposed to be going on. And something could have been implanted on the level of the 3D manufacturing that years later starts to produce forms that, this poor person never should have been, never signed up for.
Does this relate to some of the talks that you've done about de-radiodurans? This idea that you could take this, I believe it was a bacteria, the cell of a bacteria from canned foods, and blast it with radiation, and it kind of develops, doesn't it develop like a three form or four form or something like that? And then this might be some key to enhancing adaptation or evolution, and then the idea of perhaps immortality. Does that relate to those?
Well, the de-radiodurans experiment was initiated by accident, supposedly. Canned food was irradiated, ostensibly to sterilize it, and it was discovered that this radiated material food had the presence of a new bacterial form in it that wasn't dying from the radiation. In fact, it was thriving. And so Deinococcus radiodurans was the name they gave to this bacterial form and they discovered that it didn't have the strand DNA that other bacteria had. It had a toroidal, a ring
Oh
of
yeah, yeah.
DNA.
I remember you saying that.
So the ring, because it's attached to itself, has more durability than the strand. The strand, I guess, is a weaker form um, than the ring for various physics reasons. And so this ringed DNA bacterium didn't die. It actually liked radiation, and
Hmm.
it's able to gobble up radioactive waste. And I don't know, there is a guy that I wrote another newsletter on, and why his name has to escape me right now. It'll come to me in a second. But he was working at around nuclear reactors, and he was taking a drink out of the coolant, uh, the water every day. And he used to swim in the coolant tank, and he would give lectures, and he would chomp on a little piece of uranium during the lecture and show that it didn't affect him at all. So he was one of the very few people who has managed or had managed to develop was inured to the effects of ionizing radiation. And I'm thinking, well, something either was done to him or he was just one of the flukes that um, I, the name is on the tip of my tongue. If I blitzed around in my computer, I could tell you, but I'm not going to interrupt now for that. I'll think of it eventually. So yeah, I mean, they're looking for ways to harden life, to make it used to radiation. And radiation, as a form of injury to the cells, can actually provoke a healing response. I mean, many destructive forces will initially provoke a rebound from the organism. It's like if I yell at you and I'm very mean and rude to you, you're going to jump up and go, hey, don't talk to me like that. You're going to defend yourself, right? So every 5 seconds or so, a cell phone in your pocket will burp, as I call it. It's just looking for a cell tower. It pulses. And that intermittent pulse is actually not good for your biology because you're receiving it all the time. But it may have the effect of provoking functionality in your biology that you then become dependent on. It's almost like you need a slap every 5 seconds just to function. This is my own pet little theory. It's
Kind of
not,
like the smart meter too, right?
yeah, the smart meter does the same thing. It pulses many, many times a day, and it is very, it'll produce the beginning symptoms are symptoms that we generally ascribe to other things like stress. You can't sleep, you're irritable, you feel jittery and, unhappy, and you have headaches, you have something called tinnitus, where you hear buzzing and ringing in your ears. I mean, these are common symptoms of exposure to radio frequencies. Ionizing radiation, like Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Fukushima, nuclear tests and all, that's worse in that it cooks the tissue, it heats the tissue, so the damage is much more immediate and drastic. But over time, the effects of non-ionizing radiation, which is the radiation of cell phones and cell towers, is very destructive and will sterilize in terms of reproduction and cause brain cancers and sinus cancers, adenoid cancers. I mean, all kinds of issues in the glands and tissues that are exposed to the blasts.
Same principle behind why we don't stand inside of a microwave or near a microwave or a TSA body scanner. It's the same basic principle.
Right, but the enjoyment of the cellular technology is far greater than that of, I mean, people don't run to the airport to scan themselves and they don't put their head in the microwave.
Well, the TSA agents do because you can get a naked body printout. So,
well, I guess that's true. But anyway, so people really now depend on their world of 2D information.
yes.
They're hitched to it. They're leashed to it. They prefer to say hello to each other from their phones. I saw two little teenagers sitting yesterday next to each other, and they both had their phones in their hand, and they must have texted hello to each other because they looked at their phones and smiled at each other and smiled, and they said hello. So the phone was now part of the communication in direct time. That's what blows me away. The people are not happy or content or interested in communicating the old-fashioned way, which was through the eyes and ears and presence and heart. They want to do it with the phone too now.
This gets into the progress of technology through secret tech and through suppressed tech and naval tech and so forth that, believe it or not, ties into what is commonly known as MK Ultra, which was actually dozens of programs with different sub-projects, ostensibly shut down in the 70s through the investigation of the House Committee on whatever, and then but that was all baloney because it became MK Search and was moved to Fort Detrick, where it was placed under biowarfare. And that makes sense because it was, of course, dealing with LSD and things like that, chemical warfare. But as we were discussing before the talk, John Marks's book concludes on the CIA and the search for the Manchurian Candidate, I believe is the title of it. Mind Control, CIA and the search for Manchurian Candidate. Anyway, I did some talks on that book, and he concludes his book with a discussion of implants, microchips, RF technology, EMF technology, VF technology, or VLF technology, excuse me, which he argues is still part of this overarching MK Ultra. Now, what you've talked about in a lot of your discussions is Manhattan Project and Salk and vaccines, inoculations, also roughly part of MK Ultra under Atomic Energy Commission, under Department of Energy. And so, in other words, we tend to think of these things as discrete, as different, as, oh, there's this program over there, and there, oh, there's that crazy thing over there, and there's tunnels over here, and transhumanism over there. But no, actually, this is all under the same aegis. I think you're correct, of this overarching long-scale Manhattan Project of altering the biosphere. And I'm just giving credence to what you say. That there's a lot of points to back that up, that thesis up.
Yeah, I would say that radiation has the potential and capability of altering organisms from within, from their very DNA. And, it's hard to affect that from the outside. You can only do so much on the outside to alter, but the interior, the very code of life, will be what it is. I can give you any number of cosmetic surgeries and make you look totally different, but if you ever conceive a baby, it's going to have your same imprint, basically. I haven't changed that by doing plastic surgery. So the interest in getting to the very fundament root of the life code was a big deal. And they've managed to do that now. And they've kept pressing and pressing and pressing. And this came about through the medical division of the Manhattan Project, which never closed down after the Second World War, as we were told the bomb building division did.
Right.
The medical division went on to spawn all kinds of research centers and, cancer centers, cancer treatment centers, the Salk Institute, the UC, University of California chain, all kinds of big universities that people are so proud to enroll their children in are Manhattan Project offshoots.
Yes.
To say nothing of defense labs and all of that. I'm going to jump in here with an interruption. I'm interrupting myself. Can you believe it? But I did find the name of the individual who was giving talks. You can Google him and watch some YouTubes. Galen Windsor, Winsor. Galen Windsor worked, I wonder if he worked in Hanford. I can't remember which Manhattan Project facility he was at, but watch some Galen Windsor YouTubes. You'll be absolutely shocked. So that's the guy who could eat the uranium and took a bath in the coolant tank and whatnot. So the desire to rewrite the code of life and then to have that in your control and to be able to do prescriptions, on your own choice and your own decision-making basis, that's what they want. And they're very interested in pushing the Earth experience to that point where it will all be controllable. And they will be sequestered away.
Yes.
This is what I was touching on when I learned all about the tunnels and the caves, the underground system of space. There's actually space under the Earth's surface. And you can jump in now because you come from that part of the country where there's innumerable caves and caverns and rivers and lakes.
Well, this is something that's interesting that relates, that you brought up, this bizarre ceremony that was celebrated this last week, where European leaders that included Merkel, Francois Hollande, Italian Prime Minister, and other European bureaucrats, this 57-kilometer tunnel under the Swiss Alps being opened, and this really bizarre ceremony celebrating this new underground tunnel. Now, there's a lot of weirdness and bizarreness and disinformation, I think, in terms of alternative media when it comes to all this underground base stuff. But I think this shows that there's something to this, right? I mean, we've seen these pictures for so long of these giant drills that can drill these things that have been going on for decades. And from my research, there are dozens of these bases, many that we don't even know about. You've got, for example, the what is it, the Greenbrier Inn? I think it's this giant luxury resort that's in the Allegheny Mountains outside of West Virginia. This is a luxury resort that has a giant underground base beneath it. Okay, we all know about the Denver airport, which you've discussed. We know about Iron Mountain. We know about Cheyenne Mountain, NORAD. Places even like Area 51 have an underground base. Now, so what is the point of all this? Well, I believe the list goes on and on. You start to see this pattern. Oh, wait a minute. Buckingham Palace has a giant underground facility beneath it. Washington, D.C., according to James Bamford in his Puzzle Palace, uh, his book on the NSA has a giant facility underneath it. I believe it's called Crystal City or something bizarre like that. We also get from a lot of the spy fiction the idea that there are fast, what would you call it, high-speed rails that link a lot of these places. There's the um, giant underground cave network, which is the largest in the world, which is known as the Mammoth Cave Network. That it's called Cumberland Piedmont Network, and this connects Tennessee, Kentucky, North Carolina, West Virginia, Georgia, and Alabama. There are caves that link all of these states under. There's a giant world underneath uh, uh, our terra firma, right? And the point here being is that, so how is this relevant to what we're discussing? Well, back to Sofia's work on Manhattan Project. This was largely centered in Tennessee. Of course, there were facilities in different places, but Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Clinton, Tennessee, housed the bomb building facility. And the TVA, which was created by FDR, the openly communist socialist president, who, by the way, worked directly for the bankers, according to Carol Quigley in Tragedy and Hope, they engaged in these large scale public projects under the guise of solving the Depression, which was engineered by the bankers, of course. Uh, to the public works projects would give people jobs, right? And so if I'm from this Tennessee, Kentucky area, and there's a Tennessee River that was turned into a giant lake, this giant lake produced the Kentucky Dam, and this would give energy to actually build the nuke facilities. And so there's another town very close in Kentucky called Paducah. Paducah has the gaseous diffusion nuke plant, which was supposedly shut down a few years ago because of contamination. Now, have spent a lot of time in Paducah. You drive past this facility, you see the big reactors. It's very, very prominent. You can't miss it. And a lot of people in this city have gotten sick, and there have been lawsuits. It's public mainstream news. You can read about the Paducah gaseous diffusion plant lawsuits that because the plant leaked and it got into the lake and everybody's been sick. These were dismissed because the plant was under the aegis of Lockheed Martin and some sort of prevention act. So you can't really take these entities to court because they're basically the shadow government itself, right? So anyway, long story short, what I heard you describing about the Cumberland Gap was excellent because it ties into this, because that Cumberland Gap facility is part of the Cumberland Piedmont Cave Network and Mammoth Cave Network, right? So most people don't know this, right? That there's this giant underground cave network. There's countless, who knows how many underground bases just in North America. And this is a big, big, big part of the shadow government, deep state, whatever. And it is, I think, a breakaway civilization. There's no other explanation for it.
Right. It's not just a place to store documents. They gloss over these facilities as data centers, and that we need to have storage underground for. You just sent me a video on Iron Mountain. You have to save Elvis Presley's recordings and Marilyn Monroe's pictures, and I mean any number of world treasures that are susceptible to atmospheric degradation. So the fact is that this enormous world under our feet doesn't belong to us. You need very high, big, you know, machines, high level industry and industrial technological drills and bits and borers and whatnot to get into it and to make anything of it. And we don't have the capability to do that, but they do. And the amount of space that I'm learning about and the connectivity through underground lakes and rivers and the installation of rail systems. You can actually look at the grants that supposedly funded these tunnel projects and find all kinds of enormous quantities of money that don't show up in what you're actually going to see when you go through the tunnel as a Joe public, you know? So, and the workers who've been working on, for instance, the Cumberland Tunnel, the locals who worked on it said, no, it's just full of caverns and passages and doors and levels, different levels, and um, there's a there's something secret that happened there that took so long and so much money to make. And I got the sense that the Manhattan Project was driven underground. The nuclear manufacturing and production capabilities
Mm-hmm.
have been actually moved underground. And this, um, I was tipped off by someone who lives in that Kentucky tri-state area, Tennessee, Virginia, Kentucky, who was reporting on her blog on the Cumberland Tunnel. And her blog is everybodyhatescharlie.com. And when I received communications from her and she explained that, for instance, there were, I found out through my own research, 17 nuclear reactor plants that the Tennessee Valley Authority decided to embark on after the Arab oil embargo, and only 5 were completed. So 12 were nixed. And yet, in the case of one of them, the Phipps Bend plant, 50 miles from Cumberland Gap,
Mm-hmm.
they actually delivered reactors. And there was all kinds of preparation. Everybody saw this. They saw them rolling in. It was all over the papers. There's a YouTube, which you can link in your show description. And you can see the things rolling into town. And then right after the reactors arrived, the Tennessee Valley Authority decided to abandon the entire project, the Phipps Bend nuclear plant. And guess what? The reactors never left.
Mm-hmm.
So where did they go? There were 2 large spec buildings that were constructed directly after the Phipps Bend plant was canceled. And these buildings were 50,000 square feet each. They were in industrial parks. They were built on spec, supposedly to attract commercial, enterprises to rent space, but they were never rented, and they sat there. And my source says that she believes the reactors went into those huge 50,000 square foot buildings, and from there they were actually plunged underground into this network of rivers and caves and transported wherever. And that gave me this little like electric light bulb thing going off where I said it to myself, hey, if there's a world down there, and if so many of these power plants based on nuclear power were never finished, maybe those nuclear reactors have been taken underground to supply power to this underworld, this sanctuary that they're building.
Right.
Yeah.
It could possibly. I'm just throwing out ideas here. The drilling itself could require immense heat, and so there's actually a Rand Corporation document from 1972 called the Very High Speed Transit System, and this is by Robert M. Salter, and I'll link it. And what he proposes is that the he says we need jet-piercing flame jet drills, uh, lasers, or perhaps electron beams and acoustic transducers as possible ways to drill at a more more intense and more speedy in a more speedy fashion. And then he also talks about the energy source for a rock melting drill, dubbed the subterranean, is either electrical or nuclear. So it could be that some of the drills are actually nuclear uh, powered. And but the reason this is relevant is because this document, it's only 20 pages, it is a high-speed underground tunnel network proposal by the Rand Corporation back in 1972. So it has a map as well. So here you have even Rand, which is one of the biggest think tanks in the world, proposing this thesis that you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I just literally fell into this idea. It was just my mind going bit, bit, bit. What does it add up to?
Mm-hmm.
And you're exactly right. They could be powering their expansion and their connection and their refinement of this underground space. I mean, this could be the meaning of this is the real space program.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, I was going to mention that because this is a breakaway civilization. I think this is the most rational thesis in regard to this topic. I spoke last year at the Secret Space Program conference, and my presentation didn't really deal with aliens or anything like that. I was just dealing with film analysis and how the weaponization of space and the concept of breakaway civilization is littered throughout films. And I think what's a far more reasonable thesis, which you're talking about, Sophia, is the notion of an underground, because space doesn't have to be outer space. It just means space, right? Just
Right.
3D space. Well, there's a lot of 3D space underneath mountains and underneath cities and towns. You can actually watch. There's Discovery Channel type shows, History Channel type shows, where there was a whole series of underground cities, underground networks. It came out a couple years ago. A lot of them are on YouTube, and most of the large metropolitan areas have underground cities, underground bases. LA does, London does, some places in Turkey do. They're everywhere. Now, the idea of the Rand Corporation is to link all these through a giant high-speed transit, ultra high speed, by the way. So they're proposing 1,000 mile per hour, high-tech railway systems that could, take Henry Kissinger from L.A. to New York, I guess, depending upon what time Bohemian Grove starts, right?
You've been listening to the first free half of Jay's analysis, where we interviewed Sofia Smallstorm on the topic of underground bases. The interview continues and gets really interesting in hour two. There's a lot of nuggets that I saved in the second half. So if you like what you're hearing, go to jaysanalysis.com and subscribe for $4.95 at the PayPal link. You can also purchase my book, Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film, as well as getting access to my numerous archives and interviews, where presently we're covering the subject of Carroll Quigley's Tragedy and Hope, the immense geopolitical tome based on the CFR archives that really reveals the true Illuminati behind our Atlanticist Western establishment. So check that out, and thanks for listening.